This video is going to be about blank firing replica guns that are of several varieties. What you're looking at here is an Olympic BBM variety of handgun. It's supposed to emulate mechanically the size of a small .38 caliber pistol, and it usually uses either 209 shotgun primers as fake ammunition, or it might be using nail gun blanks in the extreme end, or at the minor end, really small rimfire cartridges called CB or BB caps that are just blanks. They're also called acorns or chipmunk shot cartridges. This type has a barrel that has an opening in the front that's approximately a large caliber, and then has nothing on the back here, or it might have two vents or other pathway for gases to escape. In the cases where there's a big gap in front of the cylinder gap is on purpose, and that means that there probably won't be any openings there. Also, there will be a bigger gap back here than you might want to see on a pistol that fires real cartridges. Other characteristics that are used to make a blank firing replica gun incapable of being converted or readily converted into firing ammunition include the following. Number one, making certain parts way too thin so it would only fire once. Number two, making sure the barrel does not line up with the axis of the chamber in the cylinder. This is the cylinder, and where the cartridges are put in is called the chamber. The bore of the barrel is the dead center position of it. If they don't line up exactly straight, there's no way to really convert one unless you do some creative milling of one or both parts. The easiest one at that point, to some of you, might seem to be modifying the cylinder to force it to position the cartridges where they need to be, or just drill it out and just have just one work. But then the hammer with its intended firing pin or blade won't hit correctly. So if it hits correctly back here for the cartridges you have, it would be in your best interest to convert it by ignoring the bore of this and drilling this to where it would fit a barrel there. And the other thing is, people got creative because these were normally made out of low temperature melting metals like zinc, and got really creative by carefully cutting it in pieces and then kind of sort of welding it back together again, making sure they made it exactly the way they needed it to be to really line up and fire a bullet, and then put all the parts in plaster and then put them in an oven or a kiln so they'd remelt exactly the right shape to technically work as a firearm. And then still others just use some creative work that involved something as stupid as drilling this out. Usually there's a chunk of a drill bit in here or something to keep you from getting away with it. And then just making the cylinder here just have a metal bar in it that would just hit a cartridge you just shoved into here. And it would fire once instead of 6 shots. Kind of defeats the whole purpose of even bothering with this because, again, this makes almost as much work as actually just making a real pistol. Even if it was a single shot, it would work reliably, and you could also make double barrels or pepper boxes. A lot easier than messing around with this stuff. Next. This is another more typical example, very thin top strap. The barrel is positioned way above the axis where a bullet would ever be able to go through. And in this case, also the firing pin or the blade is up here. That indicates strongly that the cartridge is way down here compared to where the barrel is, or way up high, depending on which one you were looking at. All of these are different, and depending on what year they were put out, they'll have more than that going on to prevent this from working. And again, the barrel up here will have sometimes a butt end of a drill bit shoved in there to look like a real bullet. It might have pins going through, it might have vents. But the point is, in order for this to be sold in most areas where anybody ever converted one to really firing cartridges, they had to make sure that they did as many things as needed to make sure it wouldn't fire a cartridge in any way. Some of them even deliberately move this just slightly off center to where it fires to right or left side so that you can't line it up either. This is an example where they just said to hell with it and just block it off entirely. This is a piece of metal out the front that does nothing other than make it look like a gun. And this can be for blank firing replica guns and other things like a starter pistol. Also, you may have seen starter pistols where the gap between the fake barrel and this is really, really big. This is an example of a video of someone taking one apart, an older one of them that was readily convertible, and cleaning it up. The characteristic it had is a very thick top strap, which meant it could tolerate more pressure, And let's just, back that up. See, that one doesn't have the dimple. That one does. This is the thick strap version of that one with the thicker metal on top. It's not as thin as it might look. And yes, the cartridge would still line up with this hole rather than this one. The conversion that was done illegally in Britain, for instance, was to cut the entire front off clean, find out where the bore axis should be, drilling for it, and then putting in literally just a threading pattern, and then thread in a barrel liner for a 22, so it would actually fire correctly, and keep screwing it in until it just barely touched the cylinder, and then polishing all the cylinders to fit. And then they would take the chopped off barrel they had here and just slide it over it because it was a dead ringer fit. And then they would solder it, in some cases with aluminum being melted into it, and sometimes zinc. But unless you're just going to buy one to take it apart so you can figure out how a revolver works, not really useful. But then again, as a starting point, yeah, you could use this as a starting point to make a real gun. But you'd end up just making a new gun out of it. Yes, it's at that point for the $30 as a training aid to learn trigger discipline or how to do things safely at a shooting range, to practice firing again to get used to the noise and the feel of it before you do a real gun. I can see this. I can also see it being useful for a person who wants to learn how to be a gunsmith, because remaking one of these so you can get away with firing a single shot through it would be enough of a challenge that it'd be kind of a training activity. It should also be pointed out that a lot of the people in Britain figured out that if they cut just ahead of the loading gate thing right along this line here, they could avoid some of the metal and just slide it down out of the way and cut a chop there and get away with it working too. But again, any of them that were convertible that way have been literally removed from the market. You're probably not going to find one. This one was found in Russia. This is a diagram of an actual real firearm, and I'm doing a really simple thing here. This looks like it lines up. Should work fine. But there's the gap on the top and bottom. But then again, some real guns have it. And then we just go ahead and zoom in, and we see that, yeah, there's just enough of a deviation here. I put in a tiny change like that, which you might not be able to see or notice. And again, that's caused by just making sure it's just slightly out of alignment. This is also a problem that would happen when people would get a replacement cylinder for a real gun, put it in, and not make sure it fit correctly, and it would literally start shaving part of the bullet off. Anyway, that gap there is filled in. You see this gap? It's filled in by the barrel being screwed in just deep enough to where it almost but not quite touches the cylinder. Some of them were even made when you pulled the trigger, it would shove the cylinder just a little bit forward, just enough to make sure you didn't get any flashover from the cylinder gap. Besides revolvers, obviously, there are semi-auto looking guns, and they have to have special considerations for firing correctly to have some blowback pressure, cycling the action, and doing all sorts of things. But in order to make sure you can't load a real cartridge, they get kind of creative. There's a restraint piece that's labeled 1, a slide, because it's a standard gun, and then there's the barrel that's marked 3. Now in this case, the vertical restraint piece is just a pin put inside of the actual barrel, sometimes by just drilling a hole through it, putting the pin in, and then welding it. This one is done the other direction, doesn't really matter which one. This one uses a metal blade in it, which, oddly enough, those are not really available much anymore, front firing anyway. It's useful, you can get a flashover effect for doing a movie, but not really all that useful because people would pull the blade. And then this one, the circle restraint piece, which I'm amazed anybody would ever do, was making the barrel just the wrong diameter. Okay, but people would just use a different size cartridge and just fire it by manually cycling it and firing it. Those are not really going to be on the market much, but you might find them. This is an example of somebody who designed this to have a lot of things going on to make sure that it couldn't work. Sometimes they're one pin after another put in at different angles. Sometimes they're done as a metal piece that's molded into the barrel when it's made. This is the most creative one, and I actually appreciate this one for a simple reason. This is, if you're not aware of it, this metal piece is actually an adaptation to be able to fire a rimfire round by hitting it on the edge here and have it go through its own barrel. Someone took one of them and chopped it into 3 pieces and loaded the pieces in randomly and then inset it in the barrel, and that also qualifies as a structure to prevent you from firing real cartridge. The gas discharge gaps are just going to happen because they will exist, and this will allow gas to come out, and this has also the effect of making sure that it comes out with a slight delay, and also with the sparks. And again, if you were to take one of these apart, basically this is an off-center fire system, so you could fire rimfire through it, almost. I'm not sure if that's really what it started off being, but I've seen exactly the same thing done before, and yes, there's a video of somebody taking one of these apart, realizing they could stick a 22 in it, or very close, and just putting the pieces in position so it looked exactly the same as when they bought it, but now it fired actual rimfire. And again, he built some convoluted thing to fire once. So this video has been about, again, I'm going to list them, the things that are done by companies that make blank firing replica guns to make sure you can't really fire real cartridges. Number one, doing something weird with the bore of the barrel so that it doesn't line up, so that it will either shave bullets or just not work or just blow up. Next, making a big cylinder gap. Next, putting metals in here in the softer, easier to work with zinc material so that you can get away with keeping people from being able to fire real cartridges. Next, just literally not having any space here for anything to go through, or if it does, doing weird things like making the pathway go up and down or offset and do all sorts of things. Next, using weak materials, usually in the top layer metal here, but in some cases not. The next thing I have after all of this is using odd sizes for cartridges. I didn't bring it up, but using rimfire cartridges that are traditionally center fire for the chambering, which just makes it harder to find them. And lastly, just flat out being in a country where it's easy to get a firearm. Converting these things, if you wanted to do it, is extremely dangerous. Learning from them how a gun works, even the semi-auto ones, the PAK ones, very educational, and it's safer because you can't really chamber a round that would do any good. Yeah. And the thing is, that way you could learn how guns work and maybe use one as an inspiration if you wanted to make one, but mostly the other reason is training. Teaching your dog not to flinch if you hear a shot, if you want to go bird hunting, for instance. That's what they're used for a lot. The other thing is, some of them are made to where that they have a little insert to fire a flare. The gas has to go through. That type is able to produce enough of a puff of gas to be dangerous, by the way, but also have the ability to do something useful. That's why they're tolerated. And again, last thing to say is most countries where you can buy one of these, they require at least 1 and sometimes 4 changes to the gun design to where it cannot make a cartridge go through properly. And it can be a dozen of things, mostly involving metal obstructions and moving the barrel offset by a millimeter or two so that a cartridge would not fire through it. And again, the people, like examples in Britain of people defeating this and making a gun work anyway, in some cases went to enough work that they basically just made a mold and melted the guns down that they bought, or even random pipe made of zinc, and just molded new guns and just made guns from scratch, which is what you end up doing anyway. So unless you want to do something like that, or just use this as a template to make one, there's no point in converting one of these things at all. However, the other thing about this is, again, if you want to have a training class and not have to worry about guns actually being used, you can teach people gun safety without having any live ammunition, and that's one of the things they're good for. So, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. And yes, this was based on someone asking several questions over the last few months, and I figured I should just put all the answers together. Bye.